Thanks for listening to this Word in Your Ear podcast. If you'd like to get early access to all our productions ad-free, priority booking for our live events, and to take part in our weekly quiz, go to patreon.com/wordinyourear for more details.
Well, welcome to another edition of Word in Your Ear. Now, greater love hath no man than that he tracks down and interviews all 24 ex-members of the group that he was obsessed with when he was 14 and then writes a book about it. And the book's called Searching for Dexys Midnight Runners. And it's by an old pal of the podcast, Nige Tassell. Nige, lovely to see you again.
Hello, lovely to see you.
How are you doing? All right?
I'm all right. I've walked the dog this morning and I've got a tea in a Dexys branded mug, so we're ready to go.
You're on brand. Superb, superb. Now, the book opens with a description of you. I think it was your age 14. I think it's 1983 at school. Describe to our listeners and viewers what you were wearing.
I was woolly hatted. I was donkey jacketed, and I was kind of standing on a street corner on a winter's morning, sort of blowing out that air you get in the cold morning. So pretending I was smoking. When everyone, anyone's parents' cars drove past, you'd do a little puff out to kind of make it look so you were the subject of some gossip. Oh, I saw him smoking. I wasn't remotely cool enough to smoke. So I was dressed like a Dexys Midnight Runner. I'd just come straight off a work shift, i.e. my paper round. And I was hanging on a street corner because in my bag, in my satchel, in my wasn't sort of a collection of Stax records or anything cool like that. It was my geography textbook and my ruler and set square and my packed lunch because I was on the way to school. But dreaming dreams that I was going to be recruited as second trombonist in Dexys Midnight Runners, had become part of a gang that I'd love to be part of. So
Dexys, this was 1983 though, wasn't it?
It was, yes.
So the weird thing about that is that 1983, they'd actually, the era of Dexys that you're dressed as had already evaporated. They'd moved on to the raggle-taggle gypsies. So why had you gone for the retro Dexys? Was that a kind of a male thing or something about that kind of male bonding? That
It was merely everyone wore donkey jackets to school then. It was around there was a lot of miners' strike chic and donkey jackets were dirt cheap. And There was a time, 82, 83, and I remember looking around the school playground and almost everyone was in a donkey jacket. It's before they graduated to long coats, when they were in sort of fourth year or so. So it was a practical thing. I was delivering newspapers in the absolute chill of winter in the darkness, and needed a woolly hat and needed a good warm jacket. The fact that it chimed with Dexys, I mean, I lived in the country, so it took a while for Dexys fashions, and I certainly wasn't going to go to school wearing a pair of dungarees. But I was
outside of London, things kind of took a while to filter through.
They took a while, a bit like punk, and also 1980 when Searching for the Young Soul Rebels came out, I was 11. I was still in my absolute football phase. My first issue of Smash Hits was autumn '81. So I was I'd gone back to find Searching for the Young Soul Rebels, kind of after like Show Me had come out maybe and Plan B, those singles in between the first two albums.
But what was it about, because I think it's a bit of a rite of passage, I'm guessing here, that, boys growing up into adulthood, there's something very attractive when you're about 14 about the idea of sincerity and authenticity and things being real and things not being fake. Was that something to do with the appeal of Dexys for you at that time?
I think it was. I would find them in the covers of Smash Hits. I'd find them on the cover of Smash Hits. But they still seemed against everything else that was in the mag, against the Nick Kershaws and the Kajagoogoo's, etc. So I liked the idea that they were still looking for pop, to have success, to have number one singles, but at the same time do it on their own terms, which is, the doctrine that's gone right through the band completely. And so, so the Raggle Taggle, I fell in love. I know you didn't like that first stage necessarily so much, but that was the one for me, because as a, soft as sugar lad who thinks he's harder than he actually is, who's carrying on the street corner next to all the hard kids who are waiting for the bus, all the mods and whatever. that seemed like a nice little tribe to be part of,
So those were
just a
sort of the
thing.
days of tribes, wasn't it? I mean, so
They were
at school, was there a kind of new
tribal.
romantic tribe, and then there was...
We didn't have so much new romantic. We did have a few people who were really into Japan, and so they'd have sun in their hair and kind of fringes that came down. I think sort of the Durant... I went to the rare thing, I went to an all-boys comp. So the new romantics wasn't, no one's going to be wearing a nice...
No, you wouldn't.
Lots of makeup and a bit of fey shirt, a Byron-esque shirt or anything. So we had a lot of mods, which was probably third wave of mods by then, but everyone still loving the Jam, loving the Who. I remember when the Style Council, when Speak Like a Child came out, the debut single, and all the mods just getting rid of Weller straight away. Don't like this synthesized crap, because there was a Hammond organ on it. It wasn't the kind of three-piece. So they were
drills. That's let me down.
Yeah. So they had that kind of purity as well, and everyone had that purity of their own tribe.
Yeah.
So there were only certain names you couldn't write on your pencil case. You couldn't write the Style Council and Bauhaus. You had to be really consistent with the names, and you couldn't. There were strict boundaries, and you couldn't kind of switch between the two merrily. Now, my kids listen to Spotify. They have no context to what they're listening to, so they listen to stuff. As you can see from the Miles Davis photo, and I'm in my son's bedroom at the moment.
Good parenting.
The good parenting, you don't force it on them. This is what I've learned.
I know.
You don't. You just let it filter slowly.
He probably thinks Miles Davis is contemporary. He probably thinks he's around now.
Well, there's a lot of the stuff, and a lot of the stuff they listen to. I mean, the youngest, he went through a bit of a prog stage, and then the contemporary stuff he likes has a bit of a prog edge as well. And they'll play stuff in the car, and I'll just say, "Okay, who's this?" And I'll try and guess the era, and it will be something that was recorded 2 years ago, but it sounds late 70s or even early 60s. It's got a bit of psych in it.
Now, the book is your last book, a fantastic book called CF. We did a podcast with you about it, called C86, was an exercise in tracking down all the people who were on the NME tape in the 1980s. And you wrote a book about Wembley, where you wrote about Wembley defined in 100 matches. You quite like this kind of journalistic thing where you take they're like magazine feature ideas and turn them into a book, a huge kind of sleuth-like equation. There must be something very satisfying in trying to track down 24 people, tick off all the boxes, and get the finished picture.
It's satisfying, but it comes with a bit of sphincter tightening jeopardy, With the C86 book, I knew Nigel Blackwell before I wrote the book, and I'd interviewed David Gedge before. But there were 20 other bands that I had no connection with, and all could say, no, thank you. And then the publisher sticks his hand out and asks for his money back. So you have that kind of sense of jeopardy, which makes the sense of accomplishment feel even greater, when you get that 22nd band, that final band, yes. And so I kind of, but a sucker for punishment. I just did it again with Dexys, who I had absolutely no connection with at all, never interviewed any of them and never met any of them. But on the basis of the
how did you go about this? In fact, incidentally, there were 66 members of the Waterboys, and 66 members of the Fall and 76 members of the Waterboys. That's right. So you got off lightly with only 24. But
I had one qualification. I could have got up into the 40s or 50s with Dexys, but you've got that long tail of session musicians, and are they actually members? So what I've done in the book is focus on 78 to 86, sort of the classic era, when they were called Dexys Midnight Runners, before they were, they're known as Dexys these days. So that's the kind of the various classic lineups, because you do have 3 or 4 different classic lineups and different horn sections and bass players and everything. So there's still, with 24, there's a lot of sleuthing to do.
So you found all 20. Well, you found all 24, and how did you go about that mostly?
I'd like it to be actually more difficult than it actually is. If I were writing this book 20 years ago, it would be trickier. But most people have got some sort of presence out there. Be it they're on Facebook or they've got a Twitter account or something. And so you try and persuade them. And I did have a couple of dead ends. I'll freely admit I didn't. And that makes the story a bit richer. So the first one was Kevin Archer, who, a troubled past with Kevin Rowland in terms of, when they split and bands rival, the Blue Ox Babes versus the fiddle era of Dexys. But then the next one was Pete Williams, lovely guy who was the original bass player, and then came back in the latter stages. He was then Rowland's sparring partner, vocal sparring partner in the tours they did in the early 2000s. He's a lovely guy. Everyone loves Pete. And so he was able to kind of give numbers and people, oh, Pete's on board. And then the thing mushrooms, I found this with C86. As soon as there's a tipping point when maybe you've got a dozen on board, and then everyone's going, okay, this is something proper and it's happening. And yes, I'd like to add my 2 penneth.
But there was one moment, I think, looking for Mick Gallick, where you actually resorted to taking out an ad. I thought this was really old school and analog.
This is old school, yeah.
In a Birmingham newspaper, saying, has anybody seen him?
Absolutely. I mean, with Gallick, there are 2 spellings of Gallick out there when he's mentioned online. There's one guy who works in a company in Hemel Hempstead, the only Mick Gallick I could actually find. He didn't reply. And all the rest of the band say, oh, yeah, no, he's a nice guy, yeah, but nobody out of all those had kept in touch with him at all. So yes, I was resorted to paying quite cheap actually, just £7 for a box ad in the Birmingham Evening Mail. It's quite good. But whether I had any luck or not, I'll leave that to the reader to find out.
So who out of all of them was doing the most interesting thing, the most surprising or interesting thing?
This guy called Pete Saunders, who I'm going to actually be teaming up with next month at an event, who was the original keyboard player. Who was a student, in fact. He was the only one. Everyone else had to give up their jobs, be on the dole, live at 9 to 5. And he did for a year. He deferred university, but after a year, he said, look, I've got this place at the UEA. I've got to go. So he was in the band from working out of Norwich. And in the end, he didn't make it. He dropped out before Gino then sees in the student union. The charts are announced on a Tuesday lunchtime, and all his friends going, isn't that the band you were just in? Aren't they number 1? He's like, oh, bugger. But yeah, so Pete did a variety of jobs. Was a holiday rep. He was a painter and decorator sometimes. He's contemporary of Paul Whitehouse and Charlie Higson at Norwich as well at the UEA. So he played with Serious Drinking, who came out of that, and the Higsons. He's part of all that. But then moved away from music and then came back. And when he came back, and this is what he currently does, he's a pianist in a burlesque show.
Fantastic.
Which is great. And so yes, he goes down that route, and he slips a couple of Dexys tunes in there. So we have a woman removing her clothes to the sounds of "Come On, Eileen," and no, it's all very good. So he's a really good raconteur. I'm looking forward to meeting up with him, and I do next month in London.
When you read the book, you get the impression that being in Dexys to some extent it's a bit like a cult. You know, that they all feel that they've been under this intense pressure, and there's almost brainwashed to some extent by the modus operandi of Kevin Rowland. I mean, and then you hear about the fact that, well, they all knew that he had a strange way of doing things, didn't they? So what are the kind of things they knew about it? They knew that there was a rumour that he at one point locked a band, I think, locked a band and wouldn't let them go to the pub. There was the kind of no alcohol, no drugs rule. Was that right? The no That's smiling?
Right. No smiling on stage, no making eye contact with the audience. And this went on throughout. That wasn't just in that first iteration, you know, that were really absolutely pure, you know.
Why couldn't you make eye contact with the audience?
Because you had to be different to everyone else. This is it. It was standing alone. And so what are the things that can make you stand alone? It's one, well, you're coming off the back of punk. Well, let's get into old soul. No one's getting into old soul. So that's a kind of perverse thing to do straight away. Rehearsals, they would never rehearse in a rehearsal studio. They'd never be seen anywhere where another band might be or be part of a scene at all, a Birmingham scene. So instead they would squat old buildings and play about with electricity, and they would, you know, everything was done differently. So you wouldn't be allowed a drink before a session, before a gig, you know, and there was no smoking, no drugs rule, which they all kind of, you know, the horn player was a very heavy drinker. So they got around that. And part of the Jimmy Patterson thing, and the first thing Big Jim on the trombone was that, you know, at some point he would down a pint really quickly, you know, and, but beyond that, it was all about discipline.
Yeah, discipline. And playing so hard that they broke their strings. That was an amazing detail.
I mean, this is it. And then once you come off the back of Come On, Eileen, and they go on the big tour, the big sort of 6-month tour, couple of tours of duty in the States, and that's when session musicians start to come in. Certainly on the horn section, who departed around the time, the second horn section, who departed around the time of 2IA, and they're just going, "What the hell are you doing?" And the original members going, "This is it. Look. This was a great show because, look, I've got one string left on my banjo," you know, and they're going, but this is ridiculous. This is not the way to play. We can't hear ourselves play. Yes, we can ramp it up to 11, but we've got to be able to hear ourselves through the monitors, at least first.
Yeah,
and it was all about that passion and that purity and that discipline, and to what extent
Where did that come from then? So what was he trying to model himself on a soul band leader, on a James Brown figure or something? Because it's all about control, isn't it? He wants these people to do exactly what he tells them to do, and he wants a certain sound.
Absolutely, because they rehearse within an inch of their life. They would rehearse from 9 to 1 and then 2 to 5, 7, 5 days a week. And it's everyone has to give up a job. You have to give up your studies. You have to give up girlfriends because this is your way of life. And I think that's a really strong parallel, actually. Yeah, they, obviously with Geno Washington, he was very much influenced by the 60s soul bands. And so there's an element of that where there's an element of Catholicism in there as well, of just this purity and guilt and everything having to be, kind of untainted almost. It's that purity that he was striving for all the time, all the way through those first 3 albums. Absolutely, the third album, Don't Stand Me Down. Basically they recorded that about 4 or 5 times over, because they were just going for absolutely. It had to be perfection, and God knows, it spent a lot of his own money on that. When the record company said, "Well, we've got no more money," they got one off to Montreux for 3 weeks, in Queen's studio to record it. Massive studio, expensive. Come back, one song done.
I don't know. That's a really good point. I don't know how he afforded it, because I think Search for the Young Soul Rebels, they rehearsed for 2 months before they recorded it. Rehearsed every day, all day for 2 months. I don't know how what funded that.
It was just on the dole at that point, and they were very much, and then, they did have 2 number 1 singles, and Come On Eileen, the biggest selling single of 1982. If you've got a hand in the writing of that, you've got a regular source of income to this day. That takes care of your mortgage and more besides, I imagine.
But why do you think? I think most of the people that he recruited actually were very, very young and very inexperienced. They were looking for an opportunity, weren't they? So they were prepared to put up with a huge amount of misery and grief in pursuit of a kind of an identity. They all liked the idea of being in this gang, didn't they?
Absolutely. And let's and at this point, Rowland is in his mid-20s around the time of, he was born in 53, so 78 when he starts Dexys, he's 25. And most of those who are getting recruited, the drummer, the bass player, the keyboard player, they're all like 18, 19. And so, but it's also a weird mixture. So he gets these ones who are kind of, not impressionable, malleable, but keen as, and those 7 years when you're 18 and someone's 25 are not like the 7 years when you're 60 and they're 67. There's a huge gulf. It feels like almost like at least half a generation between them, because he's got life experience and you've got none.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he's also bringing some classically trained musicians in. So he brings in Jeff Blythe, the bass, the baritone sax, the tenor sax player, who studied. He was on tour with Geno Washington, in fact. So when he rolled up and said, "Yeah, I used to play with Geno Washington," you knew he was going to get the gig, regardless how he played. But he just blew the socks off them, And so others who were just in boys band.
He looked in interesting places, didn't he? At one point, he recruits somebody. I think it's Steve Spooner from the Midland Youth Jazz Orchestra. So he's obviously watching all these places and thinking that's a potential member of the group.
There is so much planning going on, and all of them, a lot of the, their issues they had with Kevin at the time. What the take-home thing I got from most of them was just like absolute respect to him. He had this vision. He wanted us to be different. And look, there's me tracking these people down 40, 45 years later that shows that what he did was made this real different impression. He wasn't just another band. They weren't just Joe Boxers. Dexys were a band on their own. In fact, they were several bands on their own through their various iterations, because everyone was expecting the first album, okay, we've gone from A to B, now we go to B to C and then C to D. Oh no, you go back to A and go to a different B. And after 2A, you go back to A and you go to a third different B. And so what is seen as kind of commercial suicide almost, not feeding off the success you've just had and starting all over again, other than just in name. is what's given it his legacy and making us, you and me talking about it today, because he's so different. He didn't repeat it, and absolute hats off to him by kind of constantly reinventing.
Yeah, and he must have been very charismatic. Helen O'Hara is an interesting case because she had a pretty established classical music career, and she decided to jack all that in to join this group. And so it just must have seemed an exciting opportunity, mustn't it?
I think so, and these sort of times, a lot of them, Pete Williams was working in a factory. Someone else was working in a builder's merchant. Mickey Billingham, who became the keyboardist during the 2RA era, and they just think, well, it's either this or I'm stuck where I am. And I'm 18, 19. I've got no ties anywhere. My God, why don't I give it a go for a year or two? Yeah. And they still look back on it fondly. Some horrendous stories of poverty and just, being stranded on tour and just the hovels they were staying in, or in fact, if they were within about 150 miles of Birmingham, they'd have to be back in the bus. There were no kind of hotels or anything. It wasn't until the 2RA, until the money came in from Come On Eileen, that kind of, some decent hotels came into the itinerary.
But that sense of suffering was part of the equation, was it? Part of what the whole Dexys, I'm talking about really the early Dexys, what it was all about.
Absolutely. It was, not being handed thing, not being kind of flavour of the month, and if you became flavour of the month, let's how do we retreat from that, and let's do this on the bare bones of, it's the purity that's going to see us through. We don't need a big record company advance. We're going to, the purity of our songs and our vision and our lifestyle are the things that are going to bring us success. And they did, absolute fair play to them. They did bring success. But
although Kevin, to some extent, kind of seem to hobble their chances of being successful. I was going to get you to tell a couple of stories. Now, to anyone who doesn't know, explain what happened when he took out the ad in the music press.
Well, yes, if you get the issue of the edition of the NME, where Searching for the Young Soul Rebels is album of the week, glorious florid review from Danny Baker, just saying this knocks everything else that's around out of the water, absolutely. Come back a few pages, there's a full-page right-hand ad basically saying, we're not going to be speaking to the music industry anymore. We're not going to be speaking to these journalists. They just lie. They just make things up. This is their absolute moment. They've got this, which all their contemporaries would chop off arms and limbs, legs, everything for, in order to have this album of the week, a full-page really glowing album. But let's undo it by actually giving the record company, giving the enemy some money to take out a full-page ad that just says, we don't believe you, we're not talking to you anymore, we're not playing this game. It's almost look, we've arrived at that mountain, but we don't want to be consumed by what we find at the top. We've got to kind of retreat somehow. And another player, later saxophonist, said, it's that snatching defeat from the jaws of victory thing that Kevin has, where he has to reboot as soon as he's achieved what he wants to achieve. He's got to start all over again.
And the irony of that is the record company probably had to pay for that ad too.
I know, that's
shooting yourself in the foot. And what about the story about, again, more self-sabotage, when the group was supporting Bowie and he made this kind of speech from the stage. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so they find themselves at this massive outdoor concert, a race course on the outskirts of Paris. And they're supporting Bowie, and this is sort of the autumn of '82. So Come On Eileen's been massive. So they're a decent support act. They're an act that a lot of people would go to see a headline, thing like that. But they're supporting Bowie, but they get a bit bored by the sounds of it, of what Dexys doing. They want Bowie to come on, and so the French audience started chanting Bowie, and Rowan's like, what are they saying? What are they saying? And they're all chanting for Bowie, and he basically tells the audience, Brian Ferry has more talent in his little finger than David Bowie does. And he tries to goes, John, the bass player, John Rhino Edwards, who went on to be with Status Quo for decades and decades, still is. And he spoke a bit of French, and he was starting to get John, can you translate? Can you say that in French? Brian Ferry's got, more talent in his little finger. At which point the power is cut, and the band kind of come off stage, and sitting on a flight case just behind them is David Bowie, and that was it, and that was the Andy.
How did the rest of the band feel?
Some of them, well, this is it. So the ones who were more the session players, so Andy Hamilton, the saxophonist, who just he said to me, because I hung around, I went and watched Bowie, great show. This is sort of Let's Dance pomp age, so serious Moonlight tour, so really great show. Getting back to the dressing room, half of the band are going, we showed them, we told them what for, and he just goes, what are you talking about? You are supporting Bowie. You've got tens of thousands of people there, and you're just shooting yourself in the foot again. So it's that dichotomy of when you've got session musicians who kind of know the industry versus ones who only know life in Dexys.
Yeah.
And therefore we're kicking against them the whole time as opposed to kind of playing the game.
But I think the net result was, I remember the time you would have been too young to have known this, really, because you wouldn't have been reading that kind of music press. But the music press really, really turned against them, and just thought this is exasperating. And there's a whole thing about them being fake, which is kind of ridiculous, really, because it's all bands are fake in that respect. It takes just as much effort to look like Neil Young every day than it does look like Dexys or Bucks Fizz or whoever.
As soon as you stand on a stage, there's an element of artifice, so because no one does that normally.
Okay, entirely. Yeah. But, come on, Eileen, I think a part of the success was that, suddenly the black and white press didn't have much of a story. The colour press, Smash Hits in the Face, had a huge story, because suddenly here was this group, they come back and they look completely different, they're really colourful, they're really interesting. There was a girl in the group, they're making pop records, they had fiddles, there was MTV. And I think that made a huge difference. And they could kind of, their past was kind of eradicated to some extent. A lot of people just knew them as that group. Would you think that's true?
Absolutely, because, as I say, 1980, I wasn't that aware of them because I was busy watching the European Championships football.
Yeah.
But by the time I bashed it, Dexys Midnight Runners, I kind of vaguely heard of it, and then I kind of retreated. But if you look at the film, The Bridge, of the live tour that they did, the film, you look at it in the front row, and you can tell these are Smash Hits fans, and they're all in a row, and they're swinging along like this together, like they would at a Duran gig or a Spandau Ballet gig. Yeah. But then you've also got the people who went into the first album, who were maybe soul boys, maybe ex-punks, maybe mods as well, who were there to hear the old songs. So you've got this, as well as within the band, you've got this strange mix of kind of hardened professionals and slightly, more greener sort of youngsters. You've got this dichotomy in the audience as well. So the fact that he's able to have a second very successful incarnation of this band, despite these elements, is again, is testament to his forcefulness, I think, and pushing it through and pushing that vision through and imposing it on people, imposing it on fans, and everyone bought into it. Because the songs were there. The songs were there to back it up. If it were just kind of just a carapace, then, you'd see through it. But the fact is the songs are so strong on that second album as well, and the third album, So
you carried on following him all through his career?
I did, yeah. Certainly, Don't Stand Me Down. I love that album, and I couldn't understand why that got a rough press. By that stage, by 85, I Am Buying the Enemy, the serious press, and they're giving it a shoeing, just going, this is indulgent. There's no single. The best song on the album is 12 minutes long. Well, that's never going to be a single, and the record company never going to agree to that. And I think that's just a fantastic record, and I'm so delighted that kind of in later years it's had a reappraisal, because the songs on that, This Is What She's Like, is just, to me, the pinnacle of Dexys. I think it's stronger than anything on those first two albums, which I adored, which I know every single note of. To me, it's up there with Good Vibrations. It's up there with I Heard It Through the Grapevine. It's an epic song, and it's brilliant. And I compel anyone, once they finish listening to this podcast, go and stick on the full 12 minutes and play it loud, because it's astonishing record. I mean, they just alienated, because that record had a lot of spoken word stuff. Conversations between Kev and Billy Adams, the banjo player, and bands don't do that. So all the time he's trying to find this note of difference, even though he's got an established band who've had 2 number ones. They've been going 7 years by then, but still want to do things differently. And that's where legacy and longevity come from.
Well, talking about legacy, I can't really tell now whether they're still kind of in the frame, whether or not a whole new generation of people are still discovering them. Do you think they are?
I would possibly say no.
Because they might seem a bit too white, and and also they weren't that danceable. Really, it was something a bit too kind of nervous and not very kind of fluid about them.
Yeah. Well, they weren't chic.
No
certainly,
natural
there was
swing.
that, and there was that edge to them all the time. And the lyrics are, there's no soft, gentle love songs in there. There is always that edge. I mean, I went to see them last year, and I was one of the younger ones in the audience, put it that way. So I think, as much as Kevin rails against it being a nostalgia trip.
So when you say you went to see them, what do they consist of now?
So it's Kevin now with other guys who've been around. There's sort of a core of about 4 of them who've been with him for a few albums now and live shows and various things. But everyone, he did his new album in total in the first half, second half, out come the hits, and he's trying to, and he's doing new stuff. And I don't think it matches personally. And lots of the audience are waiting for that second half because he's fighting against it being, again, not being that 80s nostalgia thing. Because if we went on that'd be a way to earn a very nice living, if he wanted to go down that Rewind Festival route. But still now, at the age of 70, he still doesn't want to. And fair play, because he's stuck to his principles and he's making new music.
Isn't it? Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, because he's still doing the same thing, isn't he? He could be far more successful than he...
Absolutely, totally. Just doing all these retro shows, but he's not, and he wants to do new music and write new songs, and absolutely fair play to them, because most others, and in fact, pretty much all his contemporaries have done that. They've waved that white flag, go, okay, fair enough. I've not done anything as good as I did in 1986, and 40 years on, I'm finally going to make peace with that. He's trying to write even better songs. And absolutely fair play to him for that. Absolutely.
When you finished it and you talked to virtually all of those 24 people, I mean, did you come away with any different impressions that you hadn't had before? Did you learn anything from
them? One thing I said, because I used to be, when you see that first incarnation, and I'll hold it up to the screen, and of these street tough hoodlums, they just look like football hooligans. You wouldn't cross over the street to get away from them. You turn bolt fast, 180 degrees, and run like Billy-O, because they look hard as absolute nails. They are, in their late middle age, unfailingly really lovely, lovely people. There was no one, who's... And the fact that they agreed to it to start off with, they might just be, no, I'm not going to do that, and they were all lovely people, and Jeff, who was the mean-looking sax player who really gives it attitude, he was part of, because the horn section at first were the lead guitarists, in the way that the fiddles became the lead guitars around 2AA. So they're up front, and if you look at old stuff, Jeff is he's given it far more than Rowland. It's almost like he's more the front man, and looks double hard. He was a bit older, really double hard. And I'm just sitting in an English country garden in Cornwall on a summer's day, and his wife's just made me an orange and cardamom cake, and we're having afternoon tea, and it's extremely agreeable. But everyone's kind of at peace with things. They have grievances, and and Kevin's has tried to make his peace with a lot of former members over the years as well. But a lot of them just say, but if he hadn't done that, if he hadn't made that call to that builder's merchants, I would still be, in that trade, or if they hadn't dragged me out of the factory and put a bass guitar in my hand.
Yes, absolutely.
It's...
But also on a broader level, if you were at a party and someone said, oh, what did you do back in the day? And you said, I was in a band. And there are lots of bands you could say, fair enough. But if you say, I was a member of Dexys Midnight Runners, A, absolutely everybody's heard of them. And B, pretty much everybody has some firm idea what that might have been like. That whole idea, this was the band that used to go running together before they recorded, and it was all this spiritual bonding, and you'd want to ask people, and it's a good story, isn't it? It's a great story thing to have done.
And there is an element of myth making in there as well. Maybe their athletics career wasn't quite as regular and defined as they may have led people to believe. It's a photo opportunity at a local athletics track.
They ran to the photographer, then they ran back to the studio again.
There's one or two who did kung fu and a bit of running, but the notion that you'd see them on the streets of that country charging around together en masse, not quite true. But this is it. He understood about how to make a myth, how to become a story. Helen O'Hara, he did not meet her at a bus stop where she's got a violin case at her hand. He'd already been given her number by Kevin Archer, his previous bandmate who had the Blue Ox Babes. She'd already played with the Blue Ox Babes, and he asked for her number. And then he sends round 2 two 6'4" giants, Paul Spear, one of the saxophonists, and Big Jimmy Patterson, to go to the Birmingham School of Music to knock on her rehearsal door, said, "We need you playing in a band." It's very hard for her to say no in that circumstances. So he's understood. He's he did feed into the rock and roll tradition of myth making, and that worked really well.
Absolutely, standard's been going on forever. It's. I was in the press at the time when Annabella Lewin was revealed to have supposedly been discovered in a laundrette. This is absolute rubbish. She'd been at stage school, but you just believed it because it made a good story.
It made a good story, and fans would do it. Journalists will take it on board because it's far, far better than telling this very prosaic story otherwise. And the fans buy into it. The fans want their bands to be other and to be up there on that stage. And so if there's a kind of a fairy tale that goes alongside them, then there's
no better example of a band being other than Dexys Midnight Runners. And it's a fantastic book, Nige. And
Thank you,
the story of Dexys itself is amazing, but the individual stories, the 24 of them, are absolutely gripping too. So thanks very much. And it's out, when? June the 6th, I think?
June the 6th. So yes, at all good bookshops and bad ones, as
very
the
good.
as the
Lovely to
story
talk to you.